potential long-term consequences. Johannes put some newspaper clips up about sudden cardiac death, but there's more than that, and this is part of how some of our data is leaking into the lay press and is starting to get more of the general population both worried and also interested. And when you get people like these guys, world champion triathletes, and the latest one being Aaron, actually being withdrawn from competitive athletics, retiring, and in some cases they are having implanted defibrillators to manage their electrical instability in their hearts, you start to wonder about the consequence of these levels of exercise for heart health. And there's absolutely no doubt that because of the crossover of information from the academic field into the lay press, you are starting to get both athletes, coaches worried. And a lot of people are making a sort of direct link to sudden cardiac death, whether that's there or not. And we can maybe debate that a little bit later. I think from a scientific perspective, we've just got to ask the question, what is the real risk from these types of activities acutely for cardiovascular function? And what does that do, if anything, to the message that we all portray or want to portray about the positive impact of exercise for cardiovascular health? So I'm going to talk really about three questions. Hopefully some of this data will relate to some of the analysis comments earlier on, but we're interested in, very simply, whether acute exercise marathon running results in a depression acutely in cardiac function, and strain is just one of the techniques that we've used to assess that functional response. The second one is related. Does acute exercise lead to the release of biomarkers of cardiac damage? Probably more interest in that data actually in the lay press than there is in the functional data. And of course, are these phenomena linked? I.e., is the fatigue occurring because the heart is being damaged by these acute exposures? Okay, first thing to do, I guess, to be honest, is to define what cardiac fatigue is. This is actually not a relatively straightforward process. First and foremost, the cardiac cycle and cardiac function is quite complex. We have an ejection period, a contractility-related period. We have a relaxation and filling period. We also have isovolumetric periods. Most of these factors are also influenced by loading and heart rate, so it's really quite a complex picture. But I guess in essence, for most of our studies, in terms of systolic function, are we seeing an acute decrease in ejection fraction, the contractility of the left ventricle in most places, or in some cases are we seeing an increase in wall motion abnormalities? And I've just shown a quick table here from the Douglas paper in the late 1980s, which was also at the Kona Ironman, and you can see that there is a 10% drop in ejection fraction and obviously an increase in number of wall segments that are showing either hypo or akinetic motion during the cardiac cycle. So initially those are the sorts of things that people started to look at. In terms of diastolic function, the relaxation capacity, the ability to refill in every cardiac cycle, most of the data has simply looked at this ratio here. The ratio of peak early filling velocity to the atrial filling velocity. Here's a standard pre-race. This is the early filling velocity, peak velocity up here. This little thing here is the atrial contraction related filling velocity, roughly about 2, 2.5 to 1. Post-exercise, you see some changes. The E drops and the A goes up, and of course that ratio goes down. So those are the sort of standard indices that have been looked at in terms of marathon research. So if you go through the literature, do a quick trawl of the data related to simple marathon studies, it's not that difficult to find studies in Canada. This one is in Spain, and we've got some data in the UK, there's data in the US, there's data in Germany. I know Johannes has done a lot of this work. The key issue related to all of this stuff is if you look at it from the simplistic measurement process, there's very little that seems to happen to contractile function in terms of ejection fraction or here fractional shortening. There seems to be more consistent evidence of a decline in relaxation or ventricular filling. The problem with all of this is that basically you've got a large number of studies that have often quite small sample sizes, they have quite different populations running, and it's difficult to control things like environmental conditions and fluid intake, etc., etc., etc. So one of the things that one of our students did was to tie this all up in a meta-analysis. And I'm really just interested at the moment in moderate duration. Might sound a bit silly that marathon running is considered moderate duration, but ultra distance and long duration here are obviously the 12, 24 multi-day, 24-hour and multi-day studies. So here we've got the moderate duration, trained and untrained. Now that again might seem a little bit bizarre, but these are marathon runners who are elite marathon runners. These are your weekend warrior guys who go out and run the London Marathon with a heart on or a monkey suit or something like that. They're doing it for charity. And the interesting thing is that if you're relatively well trained, there doesn't seem to be a massive effect on ejection fraction. However, if you're untrained, the effect size is significant. And obviously you can see the longer duration effect as well. So maybe there's an impact here depending upon how you enter the race and your fitness status. But the other interesting factor is that the change in ejection fraction was also related to changes in loading. So maybe this is just that these guys are getting dehydrated, their vascular volume is decreasing, their preload is decreasing. Same thing with diastolic function. Again, moderate duration here. It's a small number of cases for this data, so we haven't been able to split them. But they do have, again, just a significant drop in terms of the effect size, and you can see that it's fairly consistent actually across the durations. Interestingly, there was no link to loading changes with this data. This was quite consistent, almost on a case-by-case basis. And obviously what I guess we would suggest for that is maybe filling-related diastolic fatigue is a little bit more sensitive and may occur before ejection phase fatigue. Now at this stage, I guess the question that we posed and a number of other people posed is, so what? You've got a little bit of a change in ejection fraction, you've got a little bit of a change in diastolic function, and you've got a whole host of real limitations. Most of our data is simple pre-post designs. You've got a one-off measurement at baseline, you've got a one-off measurement in recovery. That could be 10 minutes into recovery, could be 60 minutes, could be 6 hours into recovery. A lot of this data is field-based. You don't have control over exercise intensity, you don't have control over dietary intake, etc., etc. And there are technical limitations as to what you can do. We've talked already about load dependency. This data, I won't go into it in any great detail, but basically if you get to the end of a marathon, you lie the people down and you raise their legs, i.e. you enhance preload, quite a significant proportion of the change in cardiac function disappears. So this could well be load related. And of course when you're doing heart rate measurements and echo measurements post-race, there's nearly always an increase in heart rate compared to rest. So we were interested, as were others, to see whether the sort of developing technology around cardiovascular assessment was going to tell us anything new about this phenomenon. And there are two real major developments in non-invasive imaging related to cardiovascular function. And the first one is something called tissue Doppler. I've shown you before the